Well, I don't know about you, but I know that for me it's true that there are things in my life that I tend not to completely dedicate myself toward. Even though I probably should, and I know I should, there are things in my life that require of me a certain level of dedication, but I kind of stop short of that full commitment. And I have a story about this. When I went to college in Colorado Springs at a school that the way that we did college was that you would take one class for 3.5 weeks. It was the only class that you would have. Then you'd get like a little break, and then you'd take another one for 3.5 weeks, and you would repeat. You'd do 8 of those each school year, and so it ended up being a full load, but you would just concentrate on that one topic for those 3.5 weeks. And it worked well for me because I like to just sort of focus in on one thing at a time, and I'm not a very good multitasker. So I was not sure what I was going to major in when I started in college, but I have at the core of my being is a core value that is way up on my list of values. And the one of these core values that I hold for myself, I've held it my whole life, and it's way up there, is the core value of fun. And so my life is kind of designed around what would be most fun. And we'll just let the details work themselves out afterwards. And that has actually worked once or twice. But so what happened was that I was starting to take courses in geology, and I decided I would major in geology because I thought geology was fun because we got to be outside a lot, and we'd go in the mountains, and it was fun. So, but one of the requirements of being a geology major is that you had to take chemistry. So I was in this chemistry class, and I figured I would be fine because I took chemistry in high school. Well, as I got into it, I started to realize that chemistry is science. And I am not a scientist because science is not fun to me. And so I was not into chemistry. I couldn't get into it. And what would happen to me is that I would take the class in the morning, and then I would, was supposed to study, but the weather was so nice, I'd go after what was fun. And then I would get to the end of the day, and I would think to myself, you haven't done the homework that you're supposed to do. And I would say, but I don't want to do it. And so I kind of had this struggle where I just didn't really completely dedicate myself to chemistry that whole semester, that whole class, that block. And when I got to the end of the class, the deeper I got into it, the more and more clueless I felt, and the rest of the class just moved on past me, and I felt like I couldn't even catch up. Somehow I managed to pass. I don't know how it happened. I think it was a miracle of God, but I passed the class. But when I look back on it, I realized it was a time that required of me a certain level of dedication that I was just not willing to give. But I was dedicated. I'm a dedicated person. I've always been very, very dedicated. It just so happened that at that time in my life, I was more dedicated to fun than I was dedicated to chemistry. And I think the same thing is true for all of us. I think that there are things in our life that require of us a certain level of dedication. And we're dedicated. It's just that we're not dedicated to the things that we ought to be dedicated all the time. And most of us will more naturally dedicate ourselves to the things that suit our preferences and suit our tastes. So if there are options in life, the thing that is most appealing to us, what feels good and is fun for a lot of us, that's what we'll dedicate ourselves to, rather than the thing that maybe would be best for us to dedicate ourselves to. And so I see this playing out in my own life. I see it playing out in a lot of different ways, and I'm sure you do too. Maybe those of us who are involved in relationships, maybe a marriage, there are times when our marriage requires of us a certain level of dedication, and yet we just don't quite do it. Or maybe we're in a job where the job requires of us a certain level of commitment and dedication, and we just don't quite give it. And we also see this playing out in our spiritual life, because a lot of times in our spiritual life, we're just not willing to dedicate ourselves as completely as we could to developing our own spirituality. Well, our passage of Scripture today is from the Gospel of Luke in chapter 4, and it's at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry. Jesus was born in Bethlehem. We have very little knowledge of what happened in Jesus' life. We know that there was a time when he showed up he went to the temple with his family. They all went back to Nazareth, and he was still at the temple. We have that little story. We don't hear much else until Jesus is a full-grown adult, and it basically launches into his ministry. And so he began his ministry by being baptized. And then after he was baptized, it says that the Spirit drove him out into the wilderness where he fasted for 40 days. And then after he fasted for those 40 days, it says that he then began to do ministry. And it says in Luke chapter 4, verse 14, then Jesus, filled with the power of the Spirit, returned to Galilee. And a report about him spread through all the surrounding country. He began to teach in their synagogues and was praised by everyone. So when Jesus began his ministry, he was doing all this stuff in and around Galilee, and he was healing people, and he was doing these miraculous things, and his popularity was growing, and everybody was really excited about Jesus, and there's just this buzz in the area about Jesus. And so, and then it says that he goes back to his hometown of Nazareth. It says, when he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. So his weekly routine included going to church. And so he goes, and it says that he stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled it, and he read from that. And then further down in verse 20, it says he rolled it back up, gave it to the attendant, and then he sat down. And these are important little words here, because it says that he stood up to read. That was the custom, is that you would read Scripture standing. But when it says that he sat down, he wasn't sitting back down with the crowd. He was sitting in a chair where he would preach from, because in that tradition, they would preach sitting down. So he stood up to read, and then he sat down to preach. So then he begins to preach. He begins to preach on the passage that he had just read. And it says that all the eyes in the synagogue were fixed on him. I mean, here's this hometown hero coming home, and here he is, and he's got this great reputation, and all the eyes are on him, fixed on him, and he began to say to them, today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. And so now you can imagine the people are all kind of whispering to each other. And it says, all spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth. They said, is not this Joseph's son? He said to them, doubtless you will quote to me this proverb. And he kind of takes a turn here. Up to this point, everybody's happy with him. He's making everybody happy. Everybody's feeling great until this happens. He says, doubtless you will quote to me this proverb, doctor, cure yourself. And you will say, do here also in your hometown the things that we have heard you did at Capernaum. And in Capernaum, what did they hear about him doing? Miracles and healings and all these incredible things. And he says, so you're probably wanting me to do those things here, right? He said, truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown. But the truth is, and this is where it gets a little bit more interesting, and he starts to make people a little bit angry. He says, the truth is, there were many widows in Israel in the time of Elijah when the heaven was shut up 3 years and 6 months, and there was a severe famine over the land. He's referring to a story, and the story is about Elijah. He's referring back to this old story about Elijah. Do you all know the story of Elijah? This really amazing thing, this really miraculous thing that Elijah was part of. Elijah was a prophet of God, and there was a time in the land where it stopped raining, and so the famine was severe, and so and God led Elijah to go to this widow, and so he goes to this widow, and she has this jar of flour, and every morning the jar was miraculously filled back up. And so Elijah he brought blessing to this woman's house by being there. And so it says that, so Jesus refers to this. He says, there were many widows in Israel in the time of Elijah. There were widows everywhere. There were widows in Israel where all these people lived. And yet Elijah was sent to none of them except to a widow in Zarephath in Sidon. Elijah was not sent to the widows of Israel. Elijah was sent to a widow that was not Jewish, who was living outside of your little zone. is basically what Jesus is telling this crowd in Nazareth. He's saying, look, Elijah could have gone to any widow. He could have gone to a widow in Nazareth. He could have gone to a widow in Bethlehem. He could have gone to a widow right here in this town. But instead, God sent him to a widow who lives outside of here. And so now they're probably furrowing their brow a little bit hearing this. And then he continues. He says, yet there were also many lepers in Israel in the time of the prophet Elisha. And so he's referring now to a story about Elisha, a different prophet. None of them was cleansed except Naaman the Syrian. See, Elisha could have gone and he could have healed a leper in Nazareth or in Jerusalem, but instead God sends him to heal a leper outside of that zone. And so now they're angry, and it says they're filled with rage down in verse 28. They're filled with rage. They got up, drove him out of the town, and they lead him to the brow of a hill, and they want to push him off the hill. They're so mad at him that they want to kill him. Right at the very beginning of his ministry, the very people who watched him grow up, they want to kill him because they're so enraged. And what are they so enraged about? They're enraged because Jesus is saying that God's blessing is not just for you. God's blessing is for the very people whom you despise. And the core of this whole passage comes back to the quote from Isaiah, where in Isaiah it says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." The Spirit of the Lord was upon Christ to do the work of God. And what Jesus is saying is, this is what I'm all about. I am completely 100% dedicated to doing the work of God, to fulfilling God's purposes in the world. And that means not only fulfilling the purposes of God among all of you here in Nazareth, but it also means among the very people that you despise. The people of Nazareth were all about themselves. They were completely dedicated to their own preferences, their own tastes. They were completely dedicated to each other. And what Jesus is basically saying is, God is not only dedicated to you, but he is dedicated to other people too. The Spirit of the Lord was upon Christ to be all about the purposes of God. And guess what, church? The Spirit of the Lord is upon you to do the very same thing. The Spirit of the Lord is upon you to be 100% dedicated to the works of God. And that is not only among the people that you have a preference for, but it is also for the very people that you may despise. If we are to be people who are completely dedicated to God, it is going to require of us a level of commitment that may take us beyond where we want to go. It may require of us being dedicated to things that we would rather not do. It may require that we be dedicated more fully to those relationships in our life that that we tend to pull back from. It may require of us that we be fully dedicated to the work that God has given us, the labor that God has blessed us with. We may need to be more dedicated to that. It may mean that we be dedicated to talking with and ministering with people who we would rather not be around. The confirmands in the retreat last weekend were asked a question. Remember the question? It was the last question on the retreat. I'm not putting you on the spot. I'm just asking you to think about it. The question is, what part of me am I willing to dedicate to God? You remember that, Gabriel? What part of me am I willing to dedicate to God? And that is a question that every single one of us need to wrestle with. It is a question that we should wake up with. What part of me, God, do you want me to dedicate to you? What part of me do you want me to dedicate that I may not want to dedicate? What part of me do you want me to dedicate what part of my time, what part of my money, what part of my effort, what part of my gifts, what part of my life do you want me to dedicate to you? And it may require that we move out beyond ourselves into places where we would rather not go. But the Spirit of the Lord is upon you to do this very same thing that Jesus did, to be all about the purposes of God, 100% committed to the purposes of God, even if it means the end of a life that you've been holding on to. What part of me am I willing to give to God? What part of me am I willing to dedicate to God? If we will accept that challenge, who knows? It could be so exciting. Life could be so much better. Amen.